4 days. That is what stood, as of this recording, between the government of Canada and a 50% tariff wall on nearly $20 billion of goods crossing the world's longest undefended border. Not a threat, not a letter posted to social media. An actual proclamation, signed, dated, and sitting on a countdown clock to August the 19th. And yet, in Ottawa, in Washington, and in the border towns caught in between, the mood is not one of triumph. It is one of exhaustion, confusion, and in more than a few boardrooms on both sides of the line, quiet disbelief that it has come to this again. This is the story of how the United States ended up here, reaching for a trade law that had not been touched in 7 decades to punish its closest neighbor, only months after its own Supreme Court tore the legal floor out from under the president's original tariff plan. It is a story about whiskey poured onto pavement in Kitchener, about lumberyards in upstate New York bracing for costs to double, about a prime minister trying to hold a fractious federation together while his own negotiator's plane gets turned back by bad weather. And it is, increasingly, a story about a policy that was supposed to force Canada to bend, but that the numbers suggest may be bending Washington instead. Let's start with where this actually began, because the 50% figure making headlines this month did not appear out of nowhere. It is the latest chapter in a fight that has been running, in one form or another, since the earliest weeks of the current Trump administration. Back in early 2025, the White House invoked emergency powers to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, citing what it called a public health crisis tied to fentanyl trafficking, and separately, a national emergency over persistent trade deficits. Canada was hit with an initial blanket tariff, with certain carve-outs for goods compliant under the existing North American Trade Pact. By July of 2025, Trump told Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney directly, in a letter posted to his social media platform, that the rate would rise to 35% starting August the 1st, and that any Canadian retaliation would simply be added on top of that number. According to the BBC, that letter was one of more than 20 such notices Trump sent to trading partners that same week, part of a broader campaign to rewrite dozens of trade relationships simultaneously. Layered underneath that headline number were sector-specific tariffs that hit even harder in practice. 50% on imported steel and aluminum, 25% on cars and trucks not built in the United States, and additional duties on lumber and copper. For a country that sends roughly 3/4 of everything it exports south of the border, and whose auto industry is stitched together with American supply chains down to the bolt, this was not an abstract policy fight. It was existential for entire regions of the Canadian economy. Ontario Premier Doug Ford called it, in blunt terms, the biggest threat the province had ever faced. And he had reason to say so. Ontario, more than any other Canadian province, had the most exposure to a full economic rupture with its largest customer. Canada did not sit still. Ford ordered the Liquor Control Board of Ontario to pull American products from store shelves. He threatened to tear up a nearly $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink. At one point, he even floated a 25% surcharge on electricity flowing into 3U.S. states, a threat aimed squarely at homes in Minnesota, Michigan, and New York that depend on Ontario's grid. In a moment that circulated widely at the time, Ford was filmed emptying a bottle of Canadian-made whiskey onto the ground in Kitchener, Ontario. A gesture meant to signal defiance, even though critics on both sides of the debate pointed out that the brand in question sold the overwhelming majority of its product into the very American market being targeted. That contradiction, hurting your own export industry to prove a point to Washington, would turn out to be a preview of a much larger tension running through this entire saga. Then, in February of 2026, everything changed. On February the 20th, the United States Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump, consolidated with a related case, v. U.S Selections versus United States. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, held that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the 1977 law Trump had relied on to justify his sweeping Liberation Day tariffs, simply does not authorize a president to impose tariffs at all. The court's reasoning was almost surgically narrow. The statute gives the president the power to investigate, regulate, and even block trade during a declared emergency, but nowhere does it mention the word tariff or duty. As the Washington Legal Foundation, which filed a brief in the case, put it in reaction to the ruling, no law allows a president to unilaterally impose, raise, lower, or eliminate tariffs at will, least of all one that never says so explicitly. The financial stakes of that ruling were enormous. According to the Tax Foundation's analysis, the tariffs struck down by the court had already raised more than $160 billion for the federal government by the time of the decision, and were projected to raise as much as $1.4 trillion over the following decade, had they remained in place. The ruling erased nearly 3/4 of the new tariff revenue the administration had been counting on. It also, at least temporarily, gave companies like Doug Ford's counterparts across Canada a genuine reason for optimism. Ford himself told reporters at Queen's Park in Toronto that the decision sent a positive signal, declaring that the walls were closing in on the president's trade agenda, even as he acknowledged that tariffs tied to autos and steel, imposed under a different legal authority, remained firmly in place. That last detail matters enormously because it points directly to what happened next. The Learning Resources ruling did not end Trump's tariff strategy. It forced a pivot. Tariffs imposed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the National Security Authority covering steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, were untouched by the court's decision and stayed in effect. And rather than retreat, the administration went looking for a new legal vehicle to replace what it had just lost. It found one in a corner of federal law that had not seen daylight in generations. On July the 20th, 2026, President Trump invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 to impose an additional 50% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods. According to a legal analysis published by the law firm Wiley, Section 338 had not been used or even seriously threatened for at least 70 years. The provision allows a president to impose duties of up to 50% on a country found to be discriminating against American exports, and, critically, those tariffs can take effect just 30 days after being proclaimed, with none of the emergency declaration process that IEPA required, and that the Supreme Court had just invalidated. In 3 separate proclamations issued the same day, the administration accused Canada of discriminating against American exports in 3 specific sectors: dairy, alcoholic beverages, and motor vehicles. The Office of the United States Trade Representative said the new duties would affect close to $20 billion in annual Canadian imports. A White House fact sheet laid out the administration's case in detail. It noted that Canadian imports of American motor vehicles had fallen by roughly 22%, or $5.6 billion, between April 2025 and March 2026, compared with the same period a year earlier, a drop the White House attributed to Canadian quota rules that it says pressure automakers into shifting production north of the border, rather than exporting finished vehicles. On alcohol, the numbers were even starker. The fact sheet stated that Canadian imports of American alcoholic beverages had collapsed by about 81%, or $582 million, over roughly the same window, a direct consequence of provincial boycotts like the one Doug Ford had ordered for Ontario's liquor stores. In other words, the retaliation Canada launched in early 2025 had, by the White House's own accounting, worked well enough to become Exhibit A in the case for escalating further. According to Al Jazeera's reporting on the announcement, the new 50% tariffs cover a strikingly specific list of goods: wine, hockey sticks, cement, certain wood products including plywood and particle board, paper goods, kitchen cabinets, and more. Crucially, the administration made clear these tariffs would apply even to goods that qualify as duty-free under the existing Continental Trade Agreement, meaning compliance with that treaty, which Trump himself negotiated during his first term, would no longer shield Canadian exporters from the new duties. The White House argued this was justified because it had already declined to renew that agreement in its current form, calling it insufficiently beneficial to the United States, and had instead triggered a series of annual reviews that cast a shadow over the treaty's long-term future. It's worth pausing here to note just how personal this dispute had already become before the 50% tariffs were even announced. Trump has repeatedly floated the idea of Canada becoming, in his words, the 51st American state, a notion Canadian officials and most independent analysts regard as having no serious legal or political merit whatsoever, but one that has nonetheless colored the tone of the entire relationship. According to reporting from the entertainment trade outlet Deadline, Trump also criticized Canada sharply after Ottawa announced it would recognize Palestinian statehood, writing on his social media platform that the move would make it very hard to reach a trade deal. And just weeks before the 50% tariffs were unveiled, Trump publicly blamed Canada for wildfire smoke drifting into the United States from blazes burning through northwestern Ontario, claiming on his social media platform that the resulting air quality damage across the American mainland amounted to billions of dollars in costs that should, in his view, be added onto the tariffs Canada was already paying. A senior administration official told reporters at the time that the new 50% tariffs themselves were not directly tied to the wildfire dispute, while acknowledging that Trump had specifically asked his team for options on that front as well. Taken together, these episodes illustrate that the trade relationship between the two countries has not been managed as a narrow technical dispute over quotas and duties. It has become entangled with foreign policy disagreements, symbolic grievances, and the president's own public commentary in ways that make a clean, purely economic resolution harder to reach. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney did not mince words in response. In a public statement, he described the new tariffs as the latest in a series of unilateral American trade actions that directly violate the trilateral agreement between the two countries and Mexico. He noted that this trade dispute has already raised costs for families, and he was careful to add that this includes families in the United States, not just Canada. Carney said his government remained ready to negotiate in good faith, pointing to more than 20 new economic and security partnerships Canada has struck with other countries, as evidence it has options beyond its southern neighbor. That framing, Canada quietly diversifying its trading relationships while still keeping the door open to Washington, has become a consistent thread in how Ottawa has handled this entire episode. Now, here is where the trap in this story starts to take shape, because a 50% tariff sounds on paper like a devastating hammer blow. In practice, the evidence increasingly suggests it is a policy trap for the country that imposed it, not just the one on the receiving end. Start with the most basic test of any tariff policy. Did it shrink the trade deficit it was designed to fix? The White House's own justification for the original push cited a $46.4 billion U.S. goods trade deficit with Canada in 2025, driven heavily by Canadian oil and gas. But according to the Tax Foundation's ongoing tariff tracker, published this month, the full suite of Trump-era tariffs, including the Section 232, Section 301, and new Section 338 measures, has not meaningfully altered the overall trade balance. The same analysis estimates that before any additional foreign retaliation is even factored in, these tariffs will shave 0.4% off long-run U.S. GDP, while amounting to an average tax increase of $900 per American household in 2026 alone. That last number is worth sitting with because it cuts against the entire premise that tariffs are something foreign countries pay. They are, mechanically, a tax collected at the U.S. border and passed, in large part, to American importers and consumers. The Federal Reserve's own economists have been tracking this in close to real time. A Federal Reserve note on detecting tariff effects in consumer prices found that tariffs implemented through November of 2025 had already pushed core goods prices up by roughly 3.1% by February of 2026, and that the pass-through to consumers was, in their words, effectively complete. Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research reached a similar conclusion, estimating that more than half of tariff costs are now landing directly on American shoppers, a faster and more complete pass-through than in Trump's first term, though still not the full dollar-for-dollar transfer some economists initially feared. There is more granular data worth including here, because inflation figures can otherwise feel abstract. KPMG's economic analysis of the August 2025 Consumer Price Index found that overall prices rose 2.9% year over year that month, the hottest annual pace since the start of the year, with food at home posting its sharpest monthly increase since the middle of the pandemic. Coffee prices alone jumped close to 21% from the previous year. And the same analysis flagged that vehicle repair costs had climbed 8.5% year over year, the fastest pace in nearly 2 years, as tariffs on imported auto parts worked their way into repair shop invoices. Economists studying personal consumption data around the same period noted that tariffs function as a regressive tax in practice, hitting lower and middle income households harder because those households spend a larger share of their budgets on imported goods, while wealthier households have been more insulated and have continued driving much of the overall spending growth. None of this proves the 50% Canada-specific tariff alone is responsible for national inflation trends. Plenty of other tariffs on dozens of other countries are baked into these same numbers. But it does establish, with real data from the Federal Reserve, KPMG, and Stanford's Policy Research Institute, that the broader tariff strategy this Canada policy sits inside has a measurable ongoing cost for the same American consumers it was supposed to protect. You can see this playing out in granular human terms in the towns that sit closest to the border. In Rensselaer Falls, New York, 15 miles south of the Canadian line, a lumberyard called JP Building Supply gets roughly a third of its inventory from Canada. Plywood, sheathing, the basic materials of American home construction. According to reporting from North Country Public Radio, workers there are bracing for a tariff that could double the cost of some of that imported wood. One worker interviewed for that story said the tariffs are painful on a personal level too. Half his family lives across the border, and he has decided he won't risk crossing for a family reunion later this month because of how tense the situation has become. That is the texture of a trade war that gets lost in the percentage points. Family gatherings quietly canceled, contractors staring down higher material costs, small businesses trying to plan 6 months out without knowing what the rules will be in 30 days. The dairy piece of this dispute deserves its own explanation because it is one of the oldest and most politically sensitive irritants in the entire Canada-U.S. trade relationship. Canada operates a supply management system for dairy, eggs, and poultry, which uses production quotas and high tariffs on imports above a certain threshold to protect domestic farmers from being undercut by larger, more industrialized American operations. Washington has argued for years that Canada does not honor the specific quota volumes it agreed to under the Continental Trade Agreement, effectively keeping the higher tariff walls in place even for shipments that should qualify for duty-free treatment. Canadian officials and dairy farmer associations counter that supply management is a legitimate policy choice protecting a domestic industry and rural communities, not an act of discrimination, and that Washington's numbers overstate how much market access American producers were actually promised. That basic disagreement over what counts as fair access versus legitimate domestic protection sits underneath nearly every round of tariff escalation going back years. And it is one of the toughest pieces for negotiators to resolve, because any Canadian government that visibly dismantles dairy protections risks a serious political backlash in rural Ontario and Quebec, the same provinces whose premiers are already pushing back hardest against concessions. Meanwhile, the legal foundation Trump built this new 50% tariff on is, by most expert assessments, considerably shakier than it looks. Section 338 has essentially no modern case law behind it. It has not been tested by courts in the tariff context in living memory. And the same Supreme Court that just ruled 6-3 against the administration's use of IEEPA on the grounds that Congress never explicitly granted the president open-ended tariff power, and that courts should be skeptical of executive branch claims to sweeping new authority absent a clear statement from Congress, a principle known as the major questions doctrine, is still sitting on the bench. Legal analysts have already begun asking whether Section 338, too, could eventually face a challenge along similar lines, given how directly its aggressive new use echoes the IEEPA approach the court just rejected. The administration has, in the meantime, also pivoted to yet another statute, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, for a separate global 10% baseline tariff, itself a provision that, according to Congressional Research Service analysis, had likewise never been used to impose tariffs before this administration. The pattern is unmistakable. Each time one legal tool gets struck down, the White House reaches for a more obscure one, and each new tool carries its own untested legal risk. It's also worth understanding why the administration didn't simply stop at Section 232 tariffs once the Supreme Court struck down its IEEPA authority. According to analysis from the Congressional Research Service published through the Library of Congress, the administration responded to the Learning Resources ruling in two ways at once. First, it wound down the various tariff actions that had specifically relied on IEEPA. But second, it turned to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 to reimpose a global baseline tariff, a 10% duty on most trading partners, even though, like Section 338, that statute had never previously been used by any administration to impose tariffs in this way. That Section 122 tariff came with a built-in expiration after 150 days, meaning it functioned more as a stopgap than a long-term solution, which is part of why the Tax Foundation's modeling treats it as having limited long-run economic impact compared with the more durable Section 232 and Section 338 measures. The administration, in other words, has been cycling through nearly every available legal mechanism for imposing tariffs since February, a pattern that itself signals just how much the Supreme Court ruling constrained its options. The White House has also continued relying on IEEPA in one narrower respect, to suspend the so-called de minimis exemption that had allowed duty-free imports of low-value packages, a move being separately challenged in the Court of International Trade in a case brought by a company called Axel of Dearborn, which argues that change also exceeds the president's authority. Under the same law the Supreme Court just narrowed. There's also a raw political cost accumulating on the American side that rarely makes it into the tariff percentage headlines. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, never one to soften his language, has explicitly called on politicians in Republican-leaning American states to speak up on Canada's behalf, warning that empty factories and rising unemployment in those states would eventually become a political liability heading into future elections. Whether or not that prediction proves accurate, the underlying economic data gives it some grounding. Labor Department figures cited in trade reporting showed job growth slowing sharply during the peak of the 2025 tariff escalation, with previous month's figures revised downward and economists citing tariff-driven uncertainty as one factor making companies reluctant to hire. Inflation, too, has been creeping upward. Analysis from Morningstar projected U.S. inflation rising to around 2.7% in 2026 as businesses pass on more tariff costs, while the Peterson Institute for International Economics warned that under a combination of tariff pass-through, tightening labor supply, and looser fiscal policy, inflation climbing above 4% by the end of 2026 was not just possible, but arguably the most likely scenario. So if the tariffs are costing American households real money, generating inflation, resting on shaky legal ground, and failing to meaningfully close the trade deficit they were designed to fix, why keep pushing? Part of the answer lies in how effective the pressure campaign has been at forcing Canada back to the negotiating table, even if the tariffs themselves aren't achieving their stated economic goal. And this is where the story becomes genuinely fluid, because, as of this recording, the outcome is still unwritten. With the August 19th deadline just days away, negotiators from both countries have been meeting at a pace that has noticeably accelerated. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer for what Reuters described as their third meeting in as many weeks, with a fourth session following shortly after. Talks that, according to Canadian officials speaking to Bloomberg and other outlets, are aimed at presenting a full negotiating framework directly to President Trump before the deadline hits. According to the Globe and Mail, LeBlanc has been leading these talks largely on his own this past week, with Prime Minister Carney in Italy on a planned vacation, expected back in Ottawa by August the 17th, just 2 days before the tariffs are set to take effect. At one point, LeBlanc's own return flight to Washington was turned back to Montreal because of bad weather, a small but telling detail about just how compressed this timeline has become. The shape of a potential deal, as reported by multiple outlets, including the trade publication Transport Topics, involves the United States backing away from the new 50% Section 338 tariffs and reducing certain existing Section 232 duties on steel, aluminum, and autos. In exchange, Canada would be expected to roll back its own retaliatory tariffs, restore American alcohol to store shelves across the provinces that pulled it, and rework the dairy quota system that has long irritated Washington. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, has been directly involved alongside LeBlanc, and according to the Globe and Mail, one Canadian official reiterated that Prime Minister Carney's earlier warning still holds, that all options remain on the table for further retaliation if a deal isn't reached. But striking that deal is politically complicated in ways that go well beyond the negotiating room in Washington. Carney has to sell any agreement to a federation of provinces with sharply different interests. In Quebec, Premier Christine Frechette has signaled she wants reduced tariffs on aluminum without giving up significant ground on dairy protections, a sector Quebec's government has defended for decades. A spokesperson for Frechette said the province continues to defend its economic interests amid what she called an ongoing trade war. That single sentence captures the core dilemma Carney faces. Rolling back the very provincial alcohol bans and dairy protections that gave Canada leverage in the first place, in exchange for tariff relief that may or may not survive the next legal challenge or the next presidential mood swing. As one former Canadian government advisor, Brian Clow, told the Globe and Mail, the sheer fact that these negotiations have continued this intensely is notable. It means there's a real chance of a deal, even though nothing guarantees one. There's also a report circulating from the Canadian Alliance of British Columbia, cited widely on social media this week, estimating that a full breakdown in trade talks could cost Canada roughly 102,000 jobs. That number, unverified by major wire services at the time of this recording, has nonetheless become a talking point in the domestic Canadian debate over how hard Ottawa should push back versus how much it should simply absorb the pressure and negotiate. Interestingly, that debate is not one-sided within Canada itself. An op-ed published by the policy outlet The Hub argued that Doug Ford's aggressive retaliatory posture, including his symbolic dumping of Canadian-made whiskey, was economically incoherent, given that the vast majority of that particular brand's sales flow into the American market Ford was trying to punish. The piece argued that, given how tightly integrated the Canadian and American economies remain, especially in autos, where more than 80% of vehicles assembled in Canada are shipped south, doing comparatively little in terms of retaliation might actually serve Canada's interests better than an aggressive tit-for-tat. That is the trap, laid out in full. For the United States, doubling down on tariffs after losing the IEEPA case in the Supreme Court means resting an enormous trade policy on a 70-year dormant statute that legal experts widely view as vulnerable to the exact same constitutional skepticism that just sank the previous approach. It means American consumers absorbing measurable inflation and an estimated $900 per household tax increase, according to the Tax Foundation, all while the trade deficit the tariffs were meant to shrink has, according to that same analysis, not meaningfully moved. And it means American businesses near the border, like that lumberyard in Rensselaer Falls, bracing for cost increases on materials they cannot easily source anywhere else. For Canada, the trap looks different but is no less real. A fractured federation trying to negotiate as one voice, provincial leaders like Doug Ford and Christine Frechette pulling in sometimes contradictory directions, an export-dependent economy that genuinely cannot afford to sever ties with its largest customer, no matter how satisfying retaliatory gestures might feel in the moment, and a prime minister who has publicly promised not to accept a bad deal while privately needing one relatively soon. What makes this moment different from earlier flashpoints in 2025 is the ticking clock. Unlike previous tariff threats that were announced, delayed, renegotiated, and sometimes quietly walked back, as happened when Trump paused earlier tariffs for 30 days and Ford correspondingly paused Ontario's own retaliatory measures. This 50% tariff under Section 338 has a hard legal trigger date of August the 19th, just 30 days after its proclamation, exactly as the statute allows. There's no ambiguity about when it takes effect if no deal materializes. That structural rigidity is precisely what has, according to the Globe and Mail, lit a fire under negotiations that had previously dragged for months with comparatively little urgency. In that narrow sense, the tariff threat has clearly worked as a pressure tool. It has produced more frequent, more serious talks in the past 2 weeks than in the preceding several months combined. Whether it produces an actual durable agreement is genuinely uncertain and worth being honest about rather than pretending to know the outcome in advance. As of this recording, no final deal has been announced. Multiple credible outlets, Bloomberg, the Globe and Mail, Reuters, describe negotiations as active, serious, and accelerating, with officials on both sides expressing cautious optimism that an interim framework is achievable before the deadline. But cautious optimism has preceded previous deadlines in this saga too, including the August 1st, 2025 deadline that came and went with tariffs actually rising rather than an agreement being reached. There is a real documented history here of deadlines passing without resolution, of tariffs actually taking effect rather than being averted, and of both governments recalibrating afterward rather than striking the clean deal analysts had hoped for. Anyone telling you with total confidence right now whether August 19th ends in a handshake or a 50% wall going up is guessing, not reporting. To be fully transparent about where the verified information ends and the uncertainty begins, the core facts of the tariff announcement, the Supreme Court ruling, the specific percentage figures on trade flows, and the ongoing negotiation schedule are drawn from named checkable sources. The White House's own fact sheet, court documents from the Supreme Court itself, reporting from Reuters, the Associated Press, NPR, the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, the Globe and Mail, and CBC News, along with trade law analysis from firms like Wiley and economic modeling from the Tax Foundation and the Federal Reserve. What remains genuinely unverified or unresolved, as of this recording, includes the exact contents of any draft agreement. Reporting describes a broad framework under discussion, not a finalized text. The specific job loss projection tied to a Canadian Industry Association, which has not been independently confirmed by major wire services, and, most importantly, whether the August 19th deadline will actually be met with a deal, a further delay, or the tariffs simply taking effect as proclaimed. Anything framed in this script as still developing should be understood exactly that way. So, where does that leave the actual premise of this video? The idea that Trump's boldest trade move against Canada is failing? The tariffs have not shrunk the trade deficit they were designed to address. They rest on a legal authority that many trade lawyers view as exposed to the same constitutional problems that just killed the administration's previous tariff regime. They are measurably raising costs for American households and businesses, according to the Federal Reserve's own price tracking research. And even by the administration's preferred metric, forcing Canada into concessions, the outcome remains unresolved, hanging on negotiations that could just as easily collapse as succeed. If the goal was total economic dominance without cost to the American side, the evidence assembled here suggests that goal has not been met and may not be achievable through this particular tool at all. If the goal was simply to generate enough pressure to bring Ottawa back to a serious negotiating table, that narrower goal does appear to have worked, at least judging by how much more frequently Canadian and American officials have been meeting in the past few weeks compared to the months before. Both of those conclusions can be true at once, and that tension is really the heart of this entire story. A policy can apply real pressure and still be a trap for the country wielding it if the costs it imposes at home outweigh the leverage it generates abroad. Whether history ends up judging this 50% tariff push as a shrewd, if legally risky, pressure tactic that ultimately delivered a better trade relationship with Canada, or as a case study in self-inflicted economic and legal damage, may not be clear for months or possibly years after the dust from August 19th settles. What do you think? Is this kind of maximum pressure tariff strategy a legitimate, if blunt, tool for rebalancing trade relationships? Or does the mounting evidence of consumer costs, legal vulnerability, and diplomatic strain suggest the approach has already outlived its usefulness, regardless of how the next few days play out in Ottawa and Washington? Let us know where you land in the comments, and thank you for watching.